Hey everyone, welcome to the Road to Resurrection. It's Saturday and we've been on this journey together, walking through the Gospel of Matthew, pausing to examine and reconsider the major moments in the life of Jesus during Holy Week. And so today we come to Saturday. And when you read the biblical story following the crucifixion, Saturday seems to be a day of profound disappointment by the disciples. It's sort of a day of silence. And the gospel writers tell us that because it was the Sabbath, that the disciples pretty much stayed at home. They were pretty much inactive. I imagine they felt disconnected and isolated that day, probably not unlike we might be feeling during our time of quarantine. But we can relate with the profound feelings of disappointment, can't we? You know, of all the things we expected to deal with as you face a pandemic like we're facing, we expect anxiety and worry and fear, but we really didn't prepare ourselves for the level of disappointment that we would experience. Because it seemed like every other day we get a new message or news that something else has been postponed, something else has been canceled. In my own family, I have a daughter who's a senior in high school, and we've had to deal with the disappointment of a senior prom being canceled, with graduation being postponed or canceled. I have a son graduating from college, same thing. And you think about all of the birthday parties and all of the family dinners and little kids who were looking forward to a summer of Little League, or kids looking forward to a dance recital or a piano recital. And all those things have been most likely postponed or canceled, and hearts are broken and emotions are heavy as we face disappointment. I want to teach you a little exercise today that my friend Ted Randall taught me. And he didn't even mean to teach me. One day we were just having coffee and talking about our life experience. And he shared with me the process of reframing your life, or reframing a life experience, reframing a situation. And when you reframe something, you take a situation and you put it in a more objective frame. You put a more objective frame around it. So for instance, you may take a person who they grow up and perhaps the family struggled financially, and this person grows up bitter and maybe resentful toward their parents because they weren't able to have all the material things that other people were able to have. And so they view their childhood, and maybe they view their parents in this frame of resentment and this frame of disappointment. But then later on, they mature. Maybe they come to understand that their parents worked really hard. Maybe they come to understand that their parents didn't get the breaks that maybe they could have gotten. Or for whatever reason, they come to reframe their upbringing and reframe their childhood, reframe their parents. It's like you take them out of one frame and you put them in another, and they learn to see that experience through a frame of gratitude and a frame of appreciation. And I want to show you how the Easter story helps us do that. Because on Saturday, as we find the disciples, they have framed their lives in terms of defeat and loss and disappointment. In Matthew 27, beginning in verse 57, right following the crucifixion, we read that as evening approached, there came a man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. And that's the last we hear of the disciples from evening on Friday until Sunday morning. In Matthew's gospel, it's just completely silent all through Saturday. But we can imagine what they were going through. In fact, Luke's gospel tells us about two disciples following the crucifixion who were walking along the road to Emmaus. And without rehashing that story for you, there's one point in the conversation where one of the disciples, in speaking of Jesus, in speaking about the effect and the devastation of the crucifixion on their lives, he said, "We had hoped he was the one to redeem Israel." We had hoped. In other words, their hopes have been crushed. In other words, their lives are now complete disappointments. Their worlds imploded on Friday. These men and women who had walked away from everything, walked away from careers, walked away from friendships, walked away from entire life stories to follow Jesus of Nazareth because they believed that he was God's anointed and God's chosen. But then they watched those dreams get nailed to a cross until they were shattered. And they were framing all of their lives in terms of disappointment and loss. One afternoon this week, our family, just from cabin fever, we got in the car and we drove down to Mexico Beach. It was a beautiful day and we just wanted to get out of the house and ride and go look at the pretty water. And so as we were driving down there, Trinity made the comment, in looking at the devastation from Hurricane Michael, she said, "It's amazing how much can change in 4 hours." And we've learned that, haven't we? We've learned that we have this expectation for our lives and we never know when it's going to change. And when life doesn't go according to plan, what's the result of that? And it's disappointment. Patrick Lencioni, who's a wonderful church leader and business leader, he says that trying to devise the perfect plan is the perfect recipe for disappointment. So we can't help but experience disappointment. Disappointment is inevitable. But discouragement is a choice. Life is going to happen in ways that we don't expect. Things are not going to go according to our plan. And when they don't, we'll find ourselves in disappointment. And if we leave those circumstances and those situations in our lives framed that way, then we frame our lives for discouragement. But the Easter story teaches us to reframe everything in light of the reality of Jesus. Those disciples that day who had said, "We had hoped that he was the one," they come to realize that Christ had been with them the whole time. And they learn to reframe the silence and the disappointment of Saturday in light of the victory and the glory of Sunday. So Easter teaches us to look at our lives, to look at our losses, look at our disappointments, and to reframe them in light of God's reality, in light of God's promise that he is always with us. And if God is always with us and he is at the helm of our lives, he is the captain of our ship, then disappointment never has the final say. Because no matter how many disappointing Saturdays we might experience in our lives, we never know what tomorrow may bring. Have a great day, City Church. I cannot wait to be with you tomorrow as we celebrate Easter together.